All right, so we just finished positive reinforcement. So by now you sort of have an understanding of the flow of the training pyramids. And just like in positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, we'll be using the pyramid to frame in and kind of show the progression, the flow of the training. And so just like in positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement has three phases. Of course, we have the learning phase, which is the bottom phase, and then the intermittent phase, which is the middle phase. And this is also where we really begin to effectively generalize behaviors. And then finally, there's the top phase, which, just like in positive reinforcement, is the stem control phase, which simply means I say and the dog reliably does. So let's just jump in and work our way through the negative reinforcement pyramid. And first, let me say that you may hear us refer to it as negative reinforcement or NAPO training or avoidance training. Just know that we're referring to the same system when we use these terms. NAPO, it just means it's negative reinforcement followed by the satisfying feeling of the removal of pressure used in negative reinforcement. So that's the positive feeling. They're the same. And avoidance training is not the same as negative reinforcement, but is the end goal, or it's the final stage of negative reinforcement training. So that might sound confusing right now, but you'll understand it very, very, very clearly by the time we're finished. So don't get hung up on that. Before we jump into the pyramid, remember that negative reinforcement is simply the removal of some sort of pressure, and that it's the removal of this pressure that reinforces the desired behavior. So it's important to remember the timing of negative reinforcement as well. So just to refresh your memory, keep in mind that negative reinforcement is applied either just before a cue or simultaneously with a cue that's given. And remember that a correction or positive punishment is applied after disobedience. So I give a command, the dog fails to execute the command, then I apply the pressure as a correction to push the dog back into the behavior that I asked for. So with that, let's jump to the board. Again, we're going to begin with the bottom phase, which is the learning phase. Just remember that in positive reinforcement, we rewarded with every rep. Remember that? So it was sit, reward, sit, reward, sit, reward. Well, in negative reinforcement, we want to kind of keep that same concept. So we want to use negative reinforcement with every single repetition. We don't want to skip any, right? Every rep. So in positive reinforcement, every rep of a behavior was a bridge to the reward, or every behavior led to a mark, which led to a reward. So in negative reinforcement, because the removal of the pressure is what brings on the positive feeling, the behavior itself becomes the reward. And that's why we use negative reinforcement in every single rep in the learning phase. It's because we want every rep to have a reward, right? Which is that removal of pressure. So negative reinforcement, right? This is what it looks like. Pressure is applied just before or simultaneously with the command or cue. And when the dog does the desired behavior, the pressure is removed. And the dog experiences the return back to normalcy, which is kind of the positive feeling. So pressure is applied, right? Pressure, the dog does what I ask, the pressure is removed, and then that's the positive feeling. So sometimes when people hear the explanation of returning back to normalcy as a positive feeling, it can be confusing, or it might not make much sense. So I like to use an example that we all experience pretty much every day. So when your bladder's full, your body lets you know that it's time to find a bathroom by allowing you to feel the discomfort of the pressure, right? So when you finally relieve your bladder, the pressure is taken away, and along with the removal of pressure, there's a sense of relief, the good feeling of returning back to normalcy. So hope that makes sense. Kind of a weird example, but and as we move toward the top of the learning phase, right, the duration of the pressure is decreased until it's just a simple tap of pressure that's simultaneous with the cue. So right here, it's pressure, the dog does, the pressure is relieved, that's the positive feeling. As we get to the top, it's just pressure with the command, so sit, down, stay, whatever. And once we reach this point, we move into the middle phase of the pyramid, which again, it's the intermittent phase. So here we have two options. We can use negative reinforcement, which at this point, remember, it's just a tap of pressure simultaneous with the cue. So sit, stay, down, or I can do nothing just to give the cue with no pressure at all. So two options, right? Just a tap of the pressure with the cue, or I can do nothing at all. So during this phase, I'm really slowly weaning off the use of negative reinforcement. So I'm just using a tap less and less until the behavior is 100% reliable, or as much as can be. So, and once we reach reliability, we move to the top level of the pyramid, which we call stimulus control, where we use zero reinforcement, right? So here we're at stimulus control, and there's zero reinforcement. And so I say and the dog does. So in this sense, the top level of the positive reinforcement pyramid and negative reinforcement pyramids, they're the same, zero reinforcement. Now, the difference between the two is the method of recourse that we have available if for some reason the dog decides not to do what we've asked, right? So in positive reinforcement, if you remember, the recourse that you had available if the dog decided to be non-compliant was to remove the existential food. That was the punishment, right? It was negative punishment. So in negative reinforcement, the only recourse that we have is the use of pressure, because that's what we've used all along. So we use the same pressure that we used to teach the dog when we were using negative reinforcement to push the dog into behavior that we asked of it. So since the pressure is applied after disobedience as opposed to before or simultaneously with a cue, it's a correction or positive punishment, right? So here our recourses are positive punishment or correction. So the dog learns that if it doesn't comply with our cue, a positive punishment or a correction will follow. And so the dog understands to avoid the correction by doing what we asked. Hence, it's avoidance training. So, and this is the reason why Skinner's box experiment with the mouse is at first a good example of negative reinforcement, but not so much once he adds the light as a predictor of the electric or the stem coming on. So when Skinner added the light to the box, the light would come on and then the electric, which was the cue to push the lever. And through classical conditioning, the light predicted the electric or the pressure, which is not negative reinforcement, but rather it's a correction or a punishment, right? Because the pressure comes after the cue, after the light comes on. So it's crucial that the order stays correct, right? Pressure, and then the cue, then the behavior which turns off the pressure. And this is what makes the desire of the behavior in negative reinforcement. The release of pressure is predicted by the cue. You're essentially giving the dog a way out or a key to the puzzle. So if the release of pressure is the reward, then we want the cue that we give to come just before the release of pressure so that it's a predictor of the reward, classical conditioning, right? If we try conditioning pressure by reversing the order, in other words, the cue and then pressure, then what happens is the cue through classical conditioning will take on the value of pressure, right? And the dog may naturally begin to develop a sort of distaste for the cue. So there's power in the details. So that's the negative reinforcement pyramid. That's the system. So let's look at some, we'll take another quick glance at this and then we'll jump into some pros and cons of negative reinforcement, right? So remember, it's just the pressure is applied, the dog complies, the pressure is taken away, and that's the positive feeling. So it's pressure, dog does, and then pressure. Once it becomes a tap, we move into the intermittent phase, which is the pressure simultaneously with the cue. So sit, down, place, foos. We can do that sometimes, or we use no pressure sometimes. So we mix it up. We're slowly fading out the need of negative reinforcement. So we're proofing that command, and it's the intermittent phase because we're intermittently using the pressure. And then once that's reliable, we move into the stimulus control phase again, where we don't need pressure. So I say and the dog does. I say sit, the dog sits. I say down, the dog downs. And then if for some reason the dog decides not to down, then after disobedience, we add stem, which because it's after disobedience is a positive punishment or correction. So hope that was pretty clear. We'll jump right into some, make sure you can see the whole board. We'll jump right into some the pros and cons of negative reinforcement. All right, so we're going to jump right into the pros and cons of negative reinforcement or NAPO training or avoidance training. Some of the pros are pretty simple, right? It's very clear and easy for the dog to understand. I put leash pressure on my dog to make it sit. When the dog sits, the pressure goes away, so it's very easy. Positive reinforcement takes, remember, between 4,000 and 6,000 reps, so negative reinforcement is between 400 and 600 reps. So, I mean, that's 10 times faster, which makes training much more feasible, when especially if you're doing board and trains or you're on a time limit. So the behavior is the reward. So remember that the behavior led to the release of pressure. So the behavior becomes the source of relief. So the behavior becomes the reward. It builds concentration. The dog really starts to become focused in negative reinforcement because they don't want the pressure to come back on. Again, we're not using high levels. We're still using very low levels because it's negative reinforcement. It's meant to reinforce a behavior to make a dog want to do the behavior again. But nevertheless, the dog gets focused on that pressure not coming on, or the dog is focused on how to make that pressure go off. So it does have an immediate must key. Remember, at the top of the pyramid in negative reinforcement, when we got to the stimulus control portion, if the dog did not do, we could add correction or positive punishment. And so we have the ability to tell the dog that you have to do what I'm telling you to do. So, and we can do that immediately. Unlike in positive reinforcement, where you could take the food away, but if the dog's satiated, it doesn't really matter. Until the dog gets hungry again, it might take a few days. In negative reinforcement, the dog can understand immediately. It's reliable. It creates reliability. So the dog can't ignore the pressure of negative reinforcement, right? It's there and the dog is aware of it. Unlike in positive reinforcement, the dog can blow it off. So the dog may not perceive your reward as being worth it, or the food is worth it. Something else might be. But in negative reinforcement, the pressure's there. The pressure doesn't go away. It's very hard for a dog to ignore it. And then not the final pro in negative reinforcement, but the final pro that I'm going to list here is zero food. You don't have to have food with you to train, right? You just use your leash or you use your e-collar or whatever tool you're using, whatever type of pressure that you're using. It could be spatial pressure, doesn't matter, but you don't have to have food. So those are pretty good pros, right? And there's a lot of pros. And then the cons, of course, it's not politically correct. Most people don't understand what negative reinforcement is, especially if you're a lay person in the dog training world, or you're just, a client. It's not politically correct. When you hear negative reinforcement, you automatically think of negative as in it being a bad thing rather than it being the removal of something. So it's not politically correct. And the dog does not feel free, right? Because they're trying to escape the pressure in obedience. So the dog can look too concentrated, or even if the dog does feel free, they may not look free, right? So they're a little bit flat and there's no flash in their behavior. So if you want a flashy dog, then negative reinforcement is probably not the system that we need to be using in that scenario. But if you need reliability, it could be, right? So you have to weigh your options. It doesn't leave scars, and I don't mean like physical scars. Negative reinforcement does not leave like physical scars on a dog. So I'm not talking about holes or burns or whatever. Those are the things that give cause to it not being politically correct. The scars that I'm talking about is that if you use your negative reinforcement incorrectly, right, your dog may have an aversion to a behavior. So just like I mentioned, positive punishment and correction comes after disobedience. If some people will apply the pressure, they'll give the cue and then apply the pressure thinking they're using negative reinforcement, when really through classical conditioning, when they do that, they're teaching the dog that right after I give you a cue, right after I give you a command, pressure is going to come on. So the dog starts to not like cues and not like commands. So those are the scars that really we're talking about. And then there's no way to tell, in negative reinforcement, there's no way to tell the dog, good job. We can take away the pressure, but there's no way to add good feelings to the dog as far as any type of reward like food or praise, anything like that the dog may look to as a reward outside of just the pressure being removed. So a few cons and then plenty of pros in negative reinforcement. Some of the best ones are obviously there's immediate must key, and I like that it only takes 400 to 600 reps. So all right, that's negative reinforcement.